Ooh, ominous voice of recording in progress has started. So mind your P's and Q's, everybody. Hey, Dom. That's one of my students there. Uh, I'd like to welcome to the annual Wolverine Con here at San Bernardino Valley College, Dr. Steve Haberman, screenwriter of multiple screenplays, including a couple of Mel Brooks films, Life Stinks and Dracula, Dead and Loving It.
That's who this is.
Nominated for 3 Emmys for producing
Cool.
HBO
I like
comedy
this game.
specials, and published
Oh,
author,
yeah,
you
perfect.
mute people,
Oh,
published author of the book Silent Screams, and a graduate of USC and has taught screenwriting classes. And he's going to talk to you guys about some horror stuff. So without any further ado, whether figuratively or literally, let's give Dr. Haberman a round of applause. It is your floor, sir.
Thank you. I hear no applause, but that's all right. I'm used to that. Since we're talking about horror films, I'm going to give you just a brief rundown of where the horror film was when the person that I'm going to tell you about entered into the discussion. Horror was really one of the first things that was tackled by film. It was really perhaps the first form of storytelling before film in the caves, reportedly, anthropologists tell us that some of the stories that were told in cave dwellings were fearful stories about what was out in the dark at night and the creatures that were going to eat you. And then, of course, it became a genre. It became a literary genre in the late 1700s when Gothic novels became popular. People like Monk Lewis. His name was Monk Lewis because he wrote a book called The Monk, which was this incredibly transgressive examination of the hypocrisies of the Catholic Church at the time and the horrors of going to hell and some of the depredations that the monks were doing to civilization at the time. And that spawned Frankenstein, a novel of 1818 that was written by a 19-year-old girl. And we know what Frankenstein was about, I hope. And that was really the end of the first Gothic period of literature. And then literature went into sensation novels in the late Victorian era, where novels like Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde by Robert Louis Stevenson and The Picture of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde, and of course Dracula by Bram Stoker and Turn of the Screw by Henry James. Those were all written in a very short period at the end of the 1800s, in the end of the Victorian period in England. So England really spawned the genre of Gothic horror in the 19th century. So at the end of the 19th century, in the 1890s, really, when film became a thing, some of the subject matter was Gothic. There were many adaptations of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde in the early silent years, culminating with a sort of a big budget one in 1920, a silent one with John Barrymore, made by an American studio, Paramount. That was a big hit. Frankenstein was made a couple of times in the early silent era, and Dracula was famously made during the peak of the German expressionist cinema in the 1920s by F.W. Murnau, probably along with Fritz Lang, the genius of German expressionism in silent movies. And that adaptation of Dracula was called Nosferatu, which I hope perhaps some of you have seen. And so, I mean, it was never, film and horror were never strangers. And by the time horror became a genre, a true genre, like Westerns and, musicals and romance and comedy and things like that, which was in 1931, it was really already a storytelling trope. And the first horror film really of the sound era that started the genre in any kind of meaningful way was Dracula at Universal Studios. And that was such an enormous hit. It was directed by Todd Browning, who had directed some silent films with Lon Chaney in America. And it was really the first supernatural sound horror film ever made, and one of the few supernatural horror films made in America up until that time, because American horror was really more about haunted houses that turned out not to be haunted, you know, that there was some explanation for the hauntings and so on. But Dracula then spawned, because of its huge financial success, immediately Frankenstein, at the same studio, Universal, another version of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde at Paramount, which won the Academy Award for Best Actor for Frederick March. And the genre was off and running. And as Hollywood does, they pretty much pounded it into the ground within 15 or 16 years. By the time of 1946, most of the great works of horror literature of the 19th century had been adapted to the movies, and many of them with sequels. For example, at Universal, Frankenstein spawned Bride of Frankenstein, Son of Frankenstein, Ghost of Frankenstein. Dracula was Dracula's daughter, Son of Dracula. Then they started having them meet up, and it all culminated in 1948 with Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein, which was an excellent picture, a parody of the whole horror genre that had really started and been perpetuated at Universal at that time. And that pretty much killed the horror genre for a while. I mean, you know, if you'll pardon the expression, it drove a stake through the heart of the horror genre. And America had gone through two disasters in a row. Starting in 1929, in October of 1929, the stock market crashed, and there was a 10-year financial depression, the likes of which even we haven't seen. I mean, for 10 years, you pretty much couldn't get a job. You could not get a job. I don't care if you had a sick mother, if you had children, if you had a mortgage, couldn't get a job. So people went through that. And in a strange way, those horror films at Universal and other studios that were imitating Universal in the 30s and the early 40s, they were metaphors for the Great Depression. Because if you think about Dracula, for example, Dracula is a character that is an undead vampire, but he also comes into American society, or English society in the movie, and sucks their blood, killing them. I mean, that was a metaphor, obviously, for the Depression, for, you know, banks who had sucked the blood of farmers and homeowners, and companies that had taken investments from middle class investors and sucked their blood and blown it and gone broke. And so there were many ways that the horror film was a metaphor for the Great Depression. The monster in Frankenstein is like a worker, you know, out of work, no place to go, no home, no family. And these subtexts, which really were diagnosed, I don't think that they were intended at the time, but they were kind of diagnosed like a disease after the patient had died, when the Depression was over, and when film historians started looking back and saying, well, why were people so interested in this morbid subject matter during the 30s? And then during the 40s, of course, after the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor in December of 1941, the horror films really catered to, most of the horror films, even the ones from Universal, started, well, there were two schools really. One catered toward a younger audience, shall we say, younger than adults, because all the men went to war that were able to go. I mean, there was conscription, there was a draft. You had to go, you just had to go. So what was left in the home front were mostly wives and children. And so the horror film started to be more like what Marvel Comics are now. Universal made Frankenstein meets the Wolfman and had them fighting. You know, it's a little more juvenile than, say, the deep, dark metaphors of the horror films of the 30s during the Depression. And it ended up, as I told you before, with Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein, where in the same movie, Abbott and Costello don't just meet up with Frankenstein, that Dracula and the Wolfman are in the movie as well. And so these monster rallies, as they came to be known, really kind of well, they lowered, we'll say they lowered the IQ requirements for enjoying horror films. Now, at the same time, um, uh, a producer named Val Lewton at RKO, a rival studio to Universal, which was making low budget films, he started to make very sad, sort of melancholy and very adult horror films like Cat People and I Walked with a Zombie and The Body Snatcher and Isle of the Dead, that were ruminations on death, really. And remember, every third guy who went off to World War II didn't come home. And these were people's husbands and brothers and sons. And when your son or father or brother went off to World War II, you put a silver star in your window, a little silver star that designated to your neighbors that you were doing your bit and your men had gone off to war. And when those men were killed, which every third one was, that star would become a gold star. And as the war progressed from 1941 to 1945, you would see in the windows all of these silver stars turning to gold stars. And so the Val Lewton movies spoke to an audience, a home front audience that were dealing with death every day and the fear of death. And the movies also talked about the difference between rationality and superstition. And in most of the Val Lewton movies, the action can be explained either rationally, usually the products of a diseased mind, or supernaturally, like a werewolf or a vampire. But Val Lewton never really told you which one it was. And I think that also appealed to a World War II audience that was living with the reality of death every day. You're kind of doing that now with this pandemic a little bit. And he made a movie about a pandemic called Isle of the Dead. I just did the audio commentary for that. I've done the audio commentary on 60 classic horror films on Blu-ray and DVD. And you may have heard my voice on some of them if you listen to audio commentaries. Anyway, that movie is about a pandemic, a plague. And it takes place in 1912, and the people that are stranded on this island, dying one by one of this plague, are trying to figure out whether they're dying because of a disease or because of a vampire that may be amongst them. And so the movies were really exploring death and how mankind deals with death by spirituality, by trying to question the reality, the existence of death, of the end of our existence. Really, the horror film does two things. That's the great value of the genre, and the reason the genre, Westerns have come and gone, musicals have come and gone, comedies have come and gone. But the horror film has pretty much stayed consistent because it's about two very important things that appeal to the psychology of audiences. Number one is death, as I told you. Horror films are really kind of dress rehearsals for your death. You're going to die, right? How many people here think they're not going to die? I can't see any hands, so I'm going to say you all know that you're going to die one day. Well, a horror film is kind of, you don't think you're going to die. All right, then listen up, Lucas. Horror films are kind of dress rehearsals for our death. Even slasher films, because what does a horror film do? It puts you in proximity to death, but safely, like a roller coaster. When you're on a roller coaster, you go up and down, you go around, you think you're going to die. You know, gravity is not on your side. You're going to fall out of the thing. You're going to be thrown from it. And at the end, you come sliding in and you didn't die. You survived the roller coaster. You kind of like had a brush with your own death and you survived. And what do you do when you come in at the end of a roller coaster? You laugh because you made it. And sometimes you go again because you kind of like that safe proximity to your own mortality. Well, that's what horror films do. Horror films put the audience in the position of the victims, oftentimes. And sometimes the victims get killed and sometimes they don't. But you get to experience it. You get to experience being murdered in the shower in Psycho, you know, or torn up by a werewolf. You get to experience not, of being saved at the last minute. Either way, what a horror film's doing, it's giving you the back and forth of getting close to your own mortality through another character that you're following on the screen. And we pay for that and enjoy it because we all know, except for Lucas, that we're going to die. So the other thing that a horror film does is just the opposite. The horror film allows us to identify with evil characters, with characters that take what they want and destroy what they hate or who they hate with absolutely no regard for morality. Sociopaths, in other words, sociopaths and or psychopaths. And the reason that audiences enjoy identifying with those characters is because there's an outsider bravery to being a sociopath or a psychopath. Somebody who takes what they want or destroys who they hate with no conscience appeals to the sociopath in all of us. And we all have a little sociopath, some more than others, standing on our shoulders, whispering in our ears. And that explains the horror star, which is a phenomenon that we haven't had for many years, but that was a big deal for 100 years in the history of the horror film. The first horror star in America was Lon Chaney, the man of 1,000 faces. He played the Hunchback of Notre Dame and the Phantom of the Opera in silent versions, disfigured psychopaths that take what they want and destroy what they hate. Bela Lugosi, who played Dracula, he went on to star in many horror films. And Boris Karloff, who played the monster in Frankenstein, he became a huge star in and out of the genre. He played not only the monster in Frankenstein, he played the mummy, he was the Grinch. He was this voice of the Grinch in the original animated Grinch Who Stole Christmas. And Vincent Price, who many of you may know from being, the rapper on Michael Jackson's Thriller song. Vincent Price played sociopaths many times in House of Wax, in all the Poe movies he made, like House of Usher, Pit and the Pendulum, Mask of the Red Death. He was the abominable Dr. Phibes. Made a whole career playing sociopaths. And we thrill to the psycho's brave pursuit of love, usually inappropriate love, and vengeance, which is, of course, never appropriate. So anyway, getting back to the history, the chronology of horror. As I said, in 1948, Universal made Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein, and that pretty much ended the Gothic horror genre for about 10 years. It was replaced by science fiction horror because you may recall from history, in 1945, we dropped two, not one, but two atomic bombs on Japan to end World War II on highly populated cities, Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And all of a sudden, reality had changed because mankind, under the pressure of war, had invented a bomb that could kill everybody on Earth. For the first time in history, the apocalypse, as warned in the Bible, in Revelations, could be real. That could be a revelation. That could be the end for everybody, which is still true. We've been held in check by the fear of, mutually reciprocated destruction, first with the Soviet Union and now with the Soviet Union and China and many other countries. We don't fire nuclear missiles at each other because we're not too thrilled about them firing back at us, which would mean the end of the world. And that fear that was a shocker that came from left field in 1945, when all of a sudden the world woke up to the fact that you could devastate an entire city and everybody in it with one bomb. That fear made vampires and werewolves and creatures of superstition and even psychopaths like Jack the Ripper seem a little bit less spooky. So for about 10 years, Hollywood made, and Japan memorably once made, movies that were inspired by the fear of ultimate destruction. And those were movies like The Thing, a creature that comes from outer space that doesn't doesn't play nicely with mankind. Or The Day the Earth Stood Still, where we're warned that if we don't, we're warned by people from outer space that if we don't clean up our act, that they will destroy us just to get it over with. Or War of the Worlds, where they come from Mars and they do destroy everybody on Earth. And even movies like Invasion of the Body Snatchers, which also played on the fear of communism from the Soviet Union at the time, where people are dehumanized. In the case of Invasion of the Body Snatchers, the shells of these people are possessed more or less by creatures from outer space that have no souls. They can't love, they can't laugh, they just don't have any emotions, but they're very efficient. And that's the way we saw the Soviet Union at the time. So Gothic horror was out. Now, what this discussion is really about is a guy named Terence Fisher. And it took this long to get to Terence Fisher. Everything I've said so far is prologue. In 1957, a little tiny film company, production company in England called Hammer Films made the business decision to remake Frankenstein. And they were just looking for a way to make money. And when they decided to remake Frankenstein, they were immediately threatened by Universal, who had made 8 Frankenstein movies. But what Universal was hoping that Hammer didn't realize is that Frankenstein, the story, the original story and the title and the name were in public domain because it was written in 1818, published in 1818, written by 19-year-old Mary Shelley. And there was no copyright protection on it at all. However, what was protected was every change that Universal had made in the Frankenstein story, including the way the monster looked. And you all know the way the monster looked in Frankenstein, with the heavy brow and the flat head and the bolts on the side and the scar here and the scar here, as played by Boris Karloff and others for Universal. So it really came down to Hammer was going to have to, if they're going to remake Frankenstein, they're going to have to do it completely different than Universal had done. Well, the man who was in charge of production, a guy by the name of Anthony Hines at Hammer, he loved that, because that was a challenge. That meant that he could do something completely original. And that was exciting because he was a very creative, guy. And so he got together with fledgling screenwriter Jimmy Sangster, and they went back to the Mary Shelley novel. Now, in the Mary Shelley novel, Dr. Frankenstein, creates a monster really, but he's trying to create a man from the bodies of dead people, from corpses that he digs up from the graves or cuts down from the gallows, anywhere he can get them. And he picks what he thinks are the best parts, and he sews them together, and he endows them with life. Mary Shelley doesn't really say how. In Universal, it's electricity. It's a ray that Dr. Frankenstein captures from outer space, the ray of life, and endows this creature with life. And the creature has a criminal brain accidentally, and he goes after his maker, and he becomes a homicidal maniac, and he has to be dealt with. So all of the things that you think about in terms of Frankenstein were basically from the Universal original version. There is no hunchback assistant in the novel Frankenstein. He doesn't make the monster in a castle-like structure, a medieval sort of watchtower or whatever that's supposed to be. He doesn't use electricity. The monster, as described by Mary Shelley, does not have a flat head or a heavy brow or bolts on the sides of his neck. And so, and it takes place, we assume in 1818 or thereabouts when the novel was published. Frankenstein, the Universal movie, takes place in 1931 when the movie was made. So, so Anthony Hines and Jimmy Sangster decide they're going to go ahead, but they're going to do it in period, meaning in and around 1818, we'll say, the Regency era of England, when men wore high collars and roughly ties, And they're also going to do it in color. And no Gothic horror film had been made in color, except perhaps House of Wax a few years earlier, which was a big 3D stereophonic horror film by Warner Brothers. And they decided, Anthony Hines said, he told Jimmy Sangster, the screenwriter, tell the story of Frankenstein. But in the novel and in the Universal version, Frankenstein creates this creature and is immediately regretful. He realizes what a horrible, presumptuous slap in the face this is to God. And he immediately feels guilty about it, especially when the monster goes out and starts killing people. And so he himself hunts the monster down and helps to destroy it, and swears that he's never going to do such a thing again. And, you know, it's a come to Jesus moment, we'll say. And so what Anthony Hines tells Jimmy Sangster is, tell the story of Frankenstein on a low budget, in period, and make Frankenstein a shit. Make him a sociopath. And so that's what Jimmy Sangster very seriously does. He writes Baron Frankenstein, he makes him a baron, as this sociopath, and he's really the monster in this version of Frankenstein, which Hammer couldn't call Frankenstein because of Universal. They called it The Curse of Frankenstein. So in order to direct this movie, Anthony Hines very wisely chose an ex-editor who had been making movies for their, you know, sort of low budget second feature black and white movies for Hammer, and also a few movies for Gainsborough. Gainsborough was a company in England that were making relatively low budget costume movies that took place in England, you know, bodice rippers they were called. They were mostly romances and oftentimes involved murder and stuff like that. And what Terence Fisher is really who we're going to talk about today. He was the director of Curse of Frankenstein. And what he brought to it was his personality, his interests. Now, because of the tremendous success of Curse of Frankenstein, worldwide financial success, first color Gothic period version of Frankenstein ever made, seriously. Because of that, Terence Fisher went on to direct over a dozen Gothic horror films, mostly for Hammer, with all of the literary characters, Frankenstein, Dracula, the werewolf, the Phantom of the Opera, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. He did remakes of all of those in color, in period, and really imbuing them with his own style and his own personality. And what was that? Terence Fisher was a very conservative gentleman, English gentleman. And he was making movies about very transgressive subject matter. And so he was a Christian. He was a devout Christian. He says he didn't go to church, but he prayed and he read the Bible and he believed. And he was a bit of a, you know, he knew his Bible. And he also liked, not only did he like allegory, but he also liked fairy tales. He enjoyed fairy tales. Mostly by, you know, the Grimm brothers kind of cataloged fairy tales and rewrote them. But the original versions were pretty, if you're part of the expression, grimmer than Grimm made them. And he was a bit of a student of the early fairy tales, pre-Grimm, the unwatered down versions. And so he liked that. And he also liked the triumph of good over evil. So what he wanted to do is he wanted to make these movies kind of cautionary tales for their audience, and audiences responded. But on top of that, he was not afraid of blood and guts and gore and sexuality. He could only hint at sexuality because, remember, Curse of Frankenstein was released in 1957, which was the first of these. So we were in a fairly conservative era, but he totally pushed the boundaries. In his version of Dracula, Dracula has fangs for the first time. He slobbers blood down his chin for the first time. And more than that, really, he was played by Christopher Lee when he was young and handsome, and he's a very statuesque sexual creature that his all-female victims long for. Now, this had not been done before. The Bela Lugosi Dracula, there's a hint of subtext of sexuality to it. I mean, there almost can't not be, because, you know, it's such an evasive thing. The vampire comes into the woman's bedroom and actually penetrates her body with his fangs and draws the fluid out. And, you know, I mean, it doesn't take a brain surgeon or a rocket scientist to see the metaphor for sexuality. But Terence Fisher, he actually wanted to push that, to show it, because he would, with that sexuality, with that subtext of sexuality for vampirism, he was making a cautionary tale about decadence and about throwing your morality out the window and what happens to you. So let's go back to Curse of Frankenstein, the first one. So Curse of Frankenstein, he hires an up-and-coming TV star by the name of Peter Cushing to play Baron Frankenstein, very gaunt individual. You probably know him as the Grand Moff Tarkin in Star Wars, the first Star Wars. Well, when he was young and handsome, he played Baron Frankenstein, but he still had the cheekbones and everything. And he was a brilliant actor. And he really, not only could he show the charm, the sort of Oscar Wilde wit and decadence of the Baron Frankenstein, but also he could be cold as ice when he needed to be. And this Baron Frankenstein doesn't just create this misbegotten creature who was played by Christopher Lee, who's just horrible looking with a white eye and, you know, stitches on his face. And I mean, looks way worse than the kind of Art Deco design of the Boris Karloff monster from the Universal pictures. He's barely human, this monster. And he's not really created until almost an hour into the film. And the first hour shows the ruthlessness, tempered by charm, but the as sociopaths are, you know, but the ruthlessness, the lack of empathy, and the cold-heartedness of Baron Frankenstein. But he's a rebel. He's a rebel against his own time. And even though he can go into the drawing rooms of the wealthy of Victorian times, what he's doing is he's digging up bodies and he's stitching together this monster. And he's such a sociopath, he doesn't even see that he's doing anything wrong. And what it was really about is, it was about divine intervention. Because what happens is, he can't bring the monster to life by himself, because his assistant, and this is not a hunchback, but is his tutor, who has a conscience and doesn't want to help him anymore because he sees the evil of what it is that Frankenstein is doing. And so he won't help him. And the monster is stitched together by Frankenstein, and Frankenstein has built a lab with all the equipment that can bring it to life, but he can't do it by himself. And when he's not even in the lab, a bolt of lightning from the sky brings this monster to life. So God brings the monster to life in a Frankenstein movie. And Frankenstein has made it very clear he's an atheist and doesn't. It's not that he's like, this Frankenstein is not defying God. He just doesn't believe in God. There's no God for him. But God brings this monster to life. Well, why would God want to do that? Because the monster becomes Frankenstein's punishment. It destroys him. And in the end, because of the crimes that his monster committed, Frankenstein is blamed for them, because he's the only one who ever saw the monster. And he's led off to the guillotine at the end of this one. Now, because this was such a huge hit, there were many sequels after Curse of Frankenstein, beginning in the following year with Revenge of Frankenstein. So once he gets to the guillotine, which happens in the beginning of the sequel, his head is not cut off. It's the priest's head who was cut off, which is perfect. You know, it's perfect for a Terence Fisher movie. But Terence Fisher is reinforcing the presence of God in a Frankenstein movie by showing that Frankenstein himself, the atheist, can't perform the magic of life, only God can do that. But he does it to punish Frankenstein. So now the next movie, it was an international sensation. I mean, I can't, it was like the Star Wars of its time, we'll say. And internationally, everybody. And it started a whole genre in every country of Gothic horror. In America, Roger Corman made Edgar Allan Poe movies in period, in color, like the Hammer movies. In Italy, Mario Bava made these wonderful Gothic movies in color, you know, in period oftentimes. And so that even big studios started to make Gothic horror films. 20th Century Fox made a fabulous big budget version of Turn of the Screw called The Innocents with Deborah Carr, directed by Jack Clayton. And of course, Hitchcock made Psycho because of Curse of Frankenstein. So it restarted the genre in an even deeper, more, shall we say, self-conscious way. Now, Terence Fisher, what did he do? He went on working for Hammer. The next movie he made was Dracula. It was called Dracula in England, but Universal immediately, once they saw Warner Brothers released Curse of Frankenstein, and once Universal saw what a huge hit that was, they went to Hammer and they said, anything you want to do, we will distribute it for you. You can use our name, and you know, we will open our rights to you. So they remade Dracula with Christopher Lee as Dracula, and Van Helsing was played as a younger man by Peter Cushing, who had played Baron Frankenstein in Curse of Frankenstein. And as I told you, that was an even more obviously transgressive movie because it involved sexuality. And for the first time, Terence Fisher emphasized sexuality. All of his vampire movies, he made horror. That movie was called Horror of Dracula in America, because Universal didn't want American audiences to be confused with the Bela Lugosi Dracula, which they also owned. So it was called Horror of Dracula. We'll call it Horror of Dracula for our purposes here, so that you don't confuse it with the Bela Lugosi version. But it was called Dracula in England. And it went back to the Bram Stoker original. And Jimmy Sangster did basically the same thing. He stripped the story to Dracula is a rather sprawling novel. It takes place on many continents, and he just stripped it down and made it a lean, mean version, hitting all the highlights of the story as he had done with Curse of Frankenstein. But in this case, instead of highlighting the evil of Frankenstein, he's highlighting the sexuality of Dracula. Peter Hutchings wrote a very good book on British horror, and he described what it is that Dracula does in Terence Fisher's vampire movies this way. He said, the most appalling thing that Dracula does to Victorian women is to make them sexual. With Dracula's attempt to replace the bride staked by Harker, involving the transformation of Lucy and the threatened transformation of Mina into a highly sexualized predatory female. So far as Fisher's film is concerned, such a threat clearly has to be contained. Remember, Fisher is a devout Christian. And the narrative concludes with the appropriately ferocious fight to the death between its two authority figures, Van Helsing, who is a Christian soldier, basically, and Dracula, who's the personification of evil. See, Terence Fisher's movies, one of their themes is authority and subjugation. He creates authorities on both sides of the moral spectrum. In Dracula, which is probably the most stark example of this, in Dracula, the authority, the Christian authority, is Van Helsing. He's a younger man than usually portrayed, so he's physically strong. He's a doctor. He has 3 or 4 degrees, so he's highly educated, and he's a Christian warrior. He knows his theology and he follows it completely. I mean, he's almost, you get the idea that he is, even though he's a man maybe in his early 40s, he's celibate. You know, he's kind of like a priest or a monk, but he's highly educated and he's also strong. And so he literally tackles Dracula at the end of the movie. Now, Dracula has the strength of the ages. He's Terence Fisher said that between the two, he found that Frankenstein was the more evil character. Well, how could that be? Dracula is like a demon from hell, who sucks the blood. Well, Terence Fisher said, well, Frankenstein, yeah, Dracula is the shell of a man possessed by a demon, a vampire. But Frankenstein is a sociopath. He's a man who makes evil choices. He consciously makes evil choices because he doesn't care about humanity at all. The only thing that's important to Frankenstein are his projects. So, and anybody who gets in his way, he destroys. And Terence Fisher thought that was more evil than Dracula. For Terence Fisher, Dracula is almost an abstract of evil. He's almost like the devil. He is the personification, the Prince of Darkness, as the name of the sequel to Horror of Dracula is called, Dracula, Prince of Darkness, and Terence Fisher directed that. So that's how he saw good and evil, and so that's the authority figure in Dracula. For on the evil side, obviously, is Dracula, and who's subjugated to Dracula is everyone that he vampirizes, mostly women, and they become the brides of Dracula, which was the name of the sequel to Horror of Dracula, Brides of Dracula, which featured not Dracula but Van Helsing. Dracula's not in Brides of Dracula. Van Helsing goes and fights other vampires, and it's Peter Cushing. These are all wonderful movies, and I highly recommend them to you, because they're still good. They're still fun. They're in color. They have scores. The acting is very naturalistic. It's not exaggerated or expressionistic like in some of the Universal films, and they influenced filmmakers like Tim Burton. I mean, Sleepy Hollow is really a big budget Hammer film, and other people. Coppola's Bram Stoker's Dracula is a big budget Hammer film. And I highly recommend that you see Curse of Frankenstein, Horror of Dracula. I think you should see The Devil Rides Out, which is a later Terence Fisher film. You should see Frankenstein Created Woman. That's a wonderful movie because it's highly influenced by the story of Cinderella. Remember, I told you Terence Fisher liked allegory, and there's allegory in Frankenstein Created Woman, but it's really a Cinderella as told by the Marquis de Sade. It's like a bloody, sexualized, violent version of Cinderella with Frankenstein in it, with Baron Frankenstein in it. And I highly recommend that you see that one as well. And that would start you out on a Terence Fisher program. Now I'm going to give you 15 minutes at the end here if you want to ask me anything, or else I'll go on. Does anybody have any questions? Anybody want to ask me anything?
Any questions out there? This is all great info.
Is it good?
I'm enjoying it, and I know I'm going to be torturing my screenwriting students and other students with this information. So
there you go. As long as I'm making people unhappy, I'm happy.
I think it's fantastic. Yeah, there's it. You can put your questions too in the chat if you want, and we can grab Dr. Haberman's attention as needed. Otherwise, if you've got more to say, you have 14 minutes, and the floor is yours, sir. So
14 minutes. All right, here we go. So as I told you, in his conservative way, Terence Fisher tackled these questions of death, of sexuality, of faith, and he did it in terms of what he thought was allegory, very symbolic, religiously inspired. And not only that, but he also, in a couple of films, tackled the subject of colonialism. And it's interesting because he came from a very conservative British position in terms of colonialism. He made a remake of The Mummy, of the Karloff version of The Mummy from 1932. He made a remake in 1959. And in it, he kind of took the side of the colonizers. Now, in this era of woke politics, that is highly not cool. But for most of our Western civilization, we were on the side of the colonizers. And he made these two movies, The Mummy, in which it takes place in the 1890s, and British archaeologists go to Egypt and unearth their artifacts to bring back to England and put into museums and to study and so forth. And they unearth, unfortunately, this mummy who is not dead, but has been cursed to protect the body of his princess, the Princess Ananka, that is taken back to England by these archaeologists. So the mummy is taken by one of his living acolytes in the 19th century back to England and starts taking bloody revenge on these archaeologists for daring to blaspheme the temples of the Egyptian gods. And later on, after Terence Fisher, the genre, the Gothic horror genre, became more progressive and more questioning of Western society, with filmmakers like Roger Corman, who was very influenced by psychotherapy, and Michael Reeves, who was a very, very young man who was, influenced by the counterculture of the late 60s, and other filmmakers like Gordon Hessler, also influenced by the counterculture of the late 60s. And they would make movies that criticized the colonizers, but not Terence Fisher. Terence Fisher was on the side of Christianity and Britain. And so in both Stranglers of Bombay, which is a horror movie he made about the British colonization of India, and in The Mummy, of the British colonization of Egypt, he took the side of the people who, as their profession, were doing their jobs, basically upending these ancient cultures. And of course, being that these are horror movies, the ancient cultures take their revenge on the colonizers. But as I said, here's what Hutchings says about Stranglers of Bombay. He says, the Stranglers of Bombay offers a half-hearted, qualified defense of certain aspects of British rule in India. Both the Stranglers of Bombay and the Mummy share similar views on foreigners, be these Indians or Egyptians, and these are foreigners to England. These other cultures are consistently presented as involving a savage and ritualistic set of beliefs lurking beneath a deceptive veneer of civilized modern behavior. And that's exactly how Fisher presents them, that they have this veneer of civilization. But in Terence Fisher's world, civilization involves Christianity. So if you are a Hindu, or even, a pagan of earlier vintage than that, then really what he thought was that your customs were barbaric, and that your vengeance was a very evil overreaction to what the colonizers were doing. That's the way he felt. So his conservatism served him well in psychological explorations like in Curse of Frankenstein or Dracula. But these days, it's what some would call problematic, because he is really taking a very strong stance against other cultures as opposed to Western culture. So there's that. Now, I told you that these movies, Curse of Frankenstein, Dracula, The Mummy, Brides of Dracula, so on, they spawned, as they will in show business, because it's a business as well as an art, imitators all over the world. And the imitators were of varying qualities and varying seriousness. For example, Roger Corman in America, he decided, since England not only was responsible for the novels of Frankenstein and Dracula, but also these new remakes, that he would take the American Gothic and do the same thing that Terence Fisher had done for the British Gothic, and make them in big movies, in color, in his case in CinemaScope, but in also his case with a star, Vincent Price. And so he made 8 Edgar Allan Poe films, which artistically probably are superior to the Terence Fisher films, because Roger Corman, whom I know, is a very self-conscious artist. And he's a very personal artist, and also he is a master of cinematic technique. He's a master of cinemascope, of color contrasts, of moving camera, and so these 8 Poe films he made: House of Usher, Pit and the Pendulum, The Premature Burial, Tales of Terror, The Raven, Mask of the Red Death, and Tomb of Ligeia. Each one of them is really good, and 4 of them are masterpieces. Not just auteur masterpieces, but masterpieces within the bigger genre of horror, and more than that, masterpieces of cinema. Because Corman, before he decided to become, the drive-in master of low-budget, teenage films, he was a great young American director. And I highly recommend, after you visit Curse of Frankenstein and Dracula from Terence Fisher, go take a look at House of Usher and Mask of the Red Death. And you'll see within the same genre how another filmmaker can take in the same period, and inspired by that, how Corman made them personal and very, very cinematic works within the horror genre. One day I'll come back and do the Corman Poe films for you guys. Anybody have anything to say?
I would love to hear more about the Corman Poe films. A short film I produced a few years ago, we spoofed Fall of the House of Usher.
I want to see it. I do.
I'm trying to find it. It's one of those, it's like, all right, let's give this a shot. We were trying to get it into a festival. There's a Vincent Price festival some years ago, I think, that they were honoring him. So we're trying
the Vincentennial.
Yeah, that's exactly what it was. And so, yeah, we called it The Fall of the House of Roger. And
well, Vincent is here with us right now.
That's creepy, Steve. That is creepy. So I think we would love to have you come back and do something on that. I think around Halloween time would be fantastic.
I'm down.
So is there any thoughts, comments, questions, queries, quips, or quotes?
Come on, you guys.
Don't be bashful out there.
This is Saraif. I just want to say, Stephen, I've learned so much right now. I've always been in love with Dracula myself. So I can really relate to what you're talking about, bringing that sexuality and all of that. Sorry, I have to say this, Lucas, in front of you, but it's true.
You don't let him say sexuality?
This is a colleague. I can't.
I'm the career advisor here with the Institute of Media and Arts, but sometimes speaking these words, I just want to make sure that just going along with what you shared. Growing up watching these films or these Frankenstein and Dracula movies, I never saw behind what you just shared, what's going on with the world, with culture, and how based on these films, how we can see culture changing in front of us. So that was insightful for me. I very much appreciate that. Again, me learning today, it's all of this information. It's something to that our students can also be. I was thinking, our students will be filming pre-COVID, during COVID, and post-COVID. Right now, they're gonna be the ones to share that this history that we're in this historical moment, right?
You're right. That's why you need to see Mask of the Red Death, because that's about a pandemic through Edgar Allan Poe, translated by Roger Corman. You need to see how, you got in touch with your mortality at a very young age because of this pandemic. You're welcome.
I think too, something I talk to my students about all the time is leaning into genre to help write, especially, yes. It's like there's nothing more fearful for the artist than the blank page or the blank canvas.
Right.
And I think if you could hone in on, I spend some of my lecture time talking about genre, like if you've picked a genre, really lean into it, because that can help at least develop your world. You hope the characters are developed. So I think it's important to understand genre. And I think Hammer is, like, as Tarantino would say, almost a subgenre of horror, as well as the Corman stuff. But as you know, like and Corman got so many people started in the industry. Like
Oh, yeah.
there's another discussion that we could
Yeah.
spend weeks talking about Rogers. So
Well, I'll come back and talk to you about Corman because I have much to say. I met with him. I just finished a book for Devil's Advocate, a British publishing company, it's a monograph on Corman's Mask of the Red Death, and he was very nice and cooperative and so on. But when you guys are making your films, remember you're artists, and art is not politically correct, almost by definition. you want to deal with, you have to deal with the things that are not polite to talk about. The great thing about Terence Fisher and the Hammer films is they talked about things that were totally impolite to talk about in very polite surroundings. And that I think is what shocked the critics, especially the British critics of the time, the most, is that these movies were so beautifully designed in terms of production design and costumes and so on, and they were taking place in the 19th century, and everybody's very polite, but they're about sex, they're about death, they're about murder, they're about psychopathology and sociopathology, and but they're also about the counter, because you have to have a counter. I find very modern. See, adolescents are very negative because you don't really know yet. You have to learn that there is an opposing force, and what teaches you that there's an opposing force, and by which I mean the force of good, is history. Good always wins, even if it takes 1,000 years, like in the case of the Roman Empire. Good always wins. It may not look like it from your perspective in your little ant version of where you are in history, but in the broad picture of history, as you look at the evil cultures, they are always vanquished by a better culture. And just remember that. And the other thing is, you don't have to be politically correct as an artist. Just say you're an artist.
I love it. Well, I've got the next panel coming up.
Okay.
This was great, Steve. Appreciate it. We will be in touch, and hopefully the next time we talk, it's on campus.
That'd be nice. I'll come visit you.
Yes, it will.
All right. Talk to you.
Look forward to meeting you too.
Bye.
Bye. Bye, students.
Bye.
I'll see you in the next panel.